Hi, everybody. I'm doing a very, very short introduction of the person doing the introduction. And what I'm going to say before I get started is, of course, if you don't know me, I'm Shirley Samuels. I'm chair of Literatures in English, new chair, so I'm still getting used to it. And I've also been instructed to tell you to come to a reception in the department lounge after the Q&A after the lecture. But this is the way that I'm going to begin. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We try to acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. In addition to the Gayokono land acknowledgement, but separate from it, the American Indian Indigenous Studies faculty would like to emphasize these words. They are on the website for what is familiarly called ASP. Cornell's founding was enabled in the course of a national genocide by the sale of almost 1 million acres of stolen Indian land under the Morrill Act of 1862, after which Morrill Hall is named. To date, the university has neither officially acknowledged its complicity in this theft, nor has it offered any form of restitution to the hundreds of Native communities impacted. After that reminder, it is my serious, sincere pleasure to give a microscopic introduction to a really, really very wonderful colleague, Masha Raskolnikov, who is the medievalist who will introduce the medievalist who is speaking today. Masha is, as you know, if you know her, a wonderful teacher, a welcome colleague as associate professor in literatures in English, and currently doing the really thankless but kind of great job of being director of undergraduate studies. So I'm introducing Masha.
Hi, all. Hey, so we're living in dark times. It's possible that there have been many times just as bad or even worse, but we're not living in those other times. We're living right now. And the world is full of bad news, and the news is full of terrible and unjust suffering. I want to acknowledge that thinking about literature can feel like a small thing to spend our time on today, when we could spend all of our time reading the news of this broken world. But I also want to affirm that literature is a solace, and it is a lighthouse in the storm, beckoning us someplace more hopeful. This is especially true, I think, as I introduce Holly Crocker. Holly Crocker is a major scholar, a mind to be reckoned with in the field of English literary studies. If I may, though, I'd like to introduce her to you, first of all, as someone whose scholarship is grounded in the often thankless or insufficiently thanked labors of care. She has been the reviews editor for Postmedieval, an MLA Executive Council representative, and a member of numerous program committees, doing the groundwork for organizing at least 2 international conferences and thereby helping to showcase the work of others. She has received numerous teaching and mentoring awards at her home institution, including twice Faculty Mentor Award from the Graduate English Association. In addition to publishing her own very important monographs, more about those in a second, she has collaborated and co-edited on topics as wide-ranging as fablio, flesh, and feeling. Come to think of it, what these 3 things have in common is traditionally being culturally devalued and unthanked. She is someone who shows up for others and who shows up in this profession. Crocker's first book, Chaucer's Visions of Manhood, offered an important intervention in something that feminist scholars too often forget, that the study of gender includes examining the construction of masculinity. Her edited and co-edited contributions include Comic Provocations, Exposing the Corpus of Old French Fablio, with Catherine Schwartz, a special issue of Postmedieval on pre-modern flesh, and also Medieval Literature, Criticism, and Debates, co-edited with Vance Smith. In 2019 came The Matter of Virtue, Women's Ethical Action from Chaucer to Shakespeare, winner of the prestigious Singerman Book Prize. Matter of Virtue is kind of a life-changing book. It is a book of both scholarship and solace. It sees in writings of medieval and early modern authors an attempt to revalue what might be called feminine or subdominant virtues. Historically, women could not have virtue if virtue was defined solely by the kinds of actions that women couldn't take. Empowered, public, heroic action, Achilles or Hector stuff. In this book, Crocker is able to imagine the kind of action available to women and other excluded groups as worthy of also being understood as virtue. Women in this argument are shown in works by pre-modern authors as exercising what Crocker refers to as material virtues: endurance, kindness, empathy, dignity, patience, the ability to yield and to compromise, virtues that we are seeing little of in the world today. Sorry, I just added that. There are not instances of passivity, although these virtues mark a highly circumscribed field of activity. It's also possible to say that in what seems to be passivity, there is a sort of action being taken, but that you have to look the right way to see it. A culture fixated on individualism simply cannot see these virtues' importance. Poets and playwrights, keenly able to see where forms of life that are dominant might also be destructive, at some point started writing about the value of vulnerability and openness. Crocker's book shows that a number of authors, including Bokenham, I'm going to mispronounce the Renaissance ones, Capgrave, Chaucer, Fletcher, Henryson, Lodge, Lidgett, Shakespeare, and Spenser, were thinking about this. The matter of virtue genuinely offers an alternative to the doctrine of the self-created independent individual, and the hope that this alternative has existed, at least since the Middle Ages. Holly Crocker's work is exactly what we need right now, today. The Gottschalk Memorial Lecture was established in memory of Paul Gottschalk, professor of English at Cornell and a scholar of British Renaissance literature, the author of a beautiful book, The Meanings of Hamlet. Professor Gottschalk died in 1977 at the age of 38, which now seems so very young to me, and I'm glad that we honor his memory through this annual lecture series. Typically, the series alternates between speakers who live on the medieval or on the Renaissance sides of the English department. Holly Crocker's work, however, crosses this artificial divide with grace and power, and what she has to say feels urgently relevant for many who study contemporary ways of living ethically in the world as well. Holly Crocker is Carolina Distinguished Professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of South Carolina. She speaks to us today on Eleanor, Cobham, Feminist Subjectivity, and the Problem of the Pre/Modern.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking everyone for coming out on this beautiful October afternoon. I'm really grateful that you all did up the weather for me and my visit. Thank you to Andy Galloway for inviting me. Thank you to Masha Raskolnikov for that incredible introduction. Thank you to Emily Parsons for helping me with my travel. And thank you to the graduate students for making me feel so welcome while I've been here. I also want to say that I am deeply honored to be included in the rich intellectual tradition that is the Paul Gottschalk Memorial Lecture series, a series that I take to be a beacon of light and hope in dark and even dispiriting times. I am grateful to be here with you all, and I'm really happy to talk today about Eleanor Cobham, Feminist Subjectivity, and the Problem of the Pre-Modern. In the late 1420s, John Lidgett wrote a poem so out of keeping with his usual poetic mode that Derek Pearsall questioned its authenticity. Quote, "It is wholly unlikely that Lidgett would write a poem critical of his patron's personal conduct," unquote. Metrically, the poem, A Complaint of My Lady Gloucester and Holland, accords with Lidgett's rough line. Nonetheless, its implicit critique of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, is surprising from any poet of this era, much less one taken to be as patron-pleasing as Lidgett. Rather than explicitly criticizing the Duke, the complaint attributes the breakdown of Humphrey's marriage to a mermaid, resembling unto a chanteresse of farce like a sorceress, who bewitches Gloucester by means of false incantations and false medicines, the prince's heart against all law, from his promise his hand to draw. Doubtless the false Circe, who reigns over, we're told, a great root of witches sitting rune de boot, refers to Eleanor Cobham, who, in 1441, was accused of treason and convicted of witchcraft. Her sensational downfall happened over a decade after Lydgate's poem and over a decade after she became mistress, then second wife, to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Lydgate has never been known for being ahead of his time, so much so that this poem is sometimes cited as historical evidence of Eleanor's reputation for quote-unquote love magic when she took up with Humphrey, perhaps as early as 1424. In her 1441 examination, Cobham confesses that she did it, she used witchcraft, for to have borne a child by her lord, the Duke of Gloucester. Even so, there's no way to know if Eleanor's confession had any connection with Lydgate's earlier depiction, or if Lydgate's representation had any bearing on Eleanor's later prosecution. Instead, and this will be one of this paper's structuring propositions, this poem illustrates the distorting influence of those grand narratives that define historical periodization. Because a few details of a complaint correspond so closely to the accusations later levied against Cobham, Lydgate depicts her as a witch over a decade before she is convicted as a witch. These particulars are treated as factually salient, and much of the poem is lost to history. As I hope to make clear, historical details matter in thinking about Eleanor's storied literary trajectory. This is despite the fact that most of A Complaint for My Lady of Gloucester and Holland is about a lost princess, whom the solitary narrator, like the 300,000 peoples in that region, longs to see restored. The poem is an abstract dream vision that imagines collective political action via a representation of England's commons as virtuous, even innocent. Consequently, it presents significant challenges for historicist analysis. Paul Strome has furnished a detailed reading of this poem's topicality, but concludes almost smirkingly that the historical rupture between what the poem represents and what actually transpired is simply part of what it meant to be a Lancastrian poet. In other words, the frenetic nuances of political change that characterized 15th century England were simply too much for a poet to keep up with. Lydgate was trying to be helpful to, or even complicit with, Lancastrian dynasty building. And yet, A Complaint was subversive, even if its maker never meant for it to be so. He ends up criticizing his patron for the breakdown of his marriage. To be sure, Lydgate could never have foreseen the uproar that Eleanor Cobham's ultimate downfall prompted, given that it was probably the most scandalous event of the century. Her downfall is historically significant, but it equally shows the problems inherent to historical literary periodization. In the centuries since Eleanor Cobham was charged with witchcraft and treason in 1441, Lydgate's poem has been transformed into a speculative backstory for the notorious events related in every English chronicle of the era, and there's also like a mention of it in a Scottish chronicle, for example. Cobham was objectively the most powerful woman in England. She was married to Gloucester, who at that time was heir to the childless Henry VI. And yet, various contemporary reports emphasize her attempt to turn precarious circumstances to her personal advantage, as if she were a striving sort of social climber. The Duchess of Gloucester was accused for to destroy the king. Eleanor's clerk, Roger Bolingbroke, and her husband's chaplain and secretary, John Home, and their physician, Thomas Southwell, were arrested, along with Marjorie Jourdemain, also known as the Witch of Eye, beside Westminster. From various chronicles, this group reportedly sought to bring about King Henry's death, perhaps by crafting, then destroying a wax figure of the king. All versions suggest they cast Henry's horoscope, conjecturing of the king's death. More generous treatments report that they tried to ascertain whether Eleanor would be queen, to know what should fall of her and to what estate she should come. Every one of these acts potentially involved treason, since they directly sought or implicitly imagined the king's demise. The king's personage should have been destroyed. After they were apprehended, Roger Bolingbroke, who is also called in the chronicles Dame Eleanor Cobham's clerk of nigromancy and sorcery, was compelled to sit in a chair placed in the middle of a platform at St. Paul's Cross, with his implements of magic displayed around him, of hair scriptures, images of silver, of wax, and of other metals, and swerdes with many other diverse instrumentas of this false craft, unquote. In response, he implicated the Duchess of Gloucester, claiming to have worked by the enticement of the foresaid Dame Eleanor and of the witch. Perhaps understandably, Eleanor sought to avoid examination, and the Tuesday next following, Dame Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, fled by night into the sanctuary at Westminster. Now, following this, she was summoned to St. Stephen's Chapel. She denied everything, but when Roger Bolingbroke testified against her, she admitted to 5 charges of witchcraft and implicated Marjorie Jourdemain in her defense, as she points at the real witch, right? Now, rather than seeking to harm King Henry VI, which Eleanor steadfastly denied, she claimed she used the services of Jourdemain, whose sorceria and witchcraft that said Dame Eleanor had long time used, and be such mediciners and drinkers as the said witch made, the said Eleanor enforced the foresaid Duke of Gloucester to love her and to wed her. By confessing to using natural magic, a kind of potions that bring about love rather than a diabolical magic that would signal a kind of pact with the devil, Eleanor saved herself from punishment for treason. Roger Bolingbroke, by contrast, was drawn and quartered, and Jourdemain was burned at the stake. We're told this was for cause of relapse. There is evidence in the chronicles that she was involved in witchcraft in the 1430s, again, in service to elite women. And there's a whole story there, right, is how elite women use the services of lower status women as witches, right? Now, so she's, sort of told that that this is how she why she was burned at the stake. Nonetheless, Eleanor was convicted of witchcraft by an ecclesiastical court. She was ordered to do public penance on 3 different market days around London. She was forcibly divorced from her husband, Duke Humphrey, since their love match was a product of witchcraft, and she was imprisoned for life at various castles and strongholds, so in at least 4, including a stay at a remote castle on the Isle of Man and one on the Isle of Anglesey, under Henry VI's strict orders. Eleanor did not go quietly, however. To avoid her sentence, an English chronicle observes, but the same Dame Eleanor was loath to go out of sanctuary, and fainted her sick, and would have stole away privily by water, but she was left to her purpose, and led forth to the castle before said. Chronicles confirm the dire situation Eleanor faced, but they also pass judgment on her as an icon of feminine perfidy, whose pride, false covetous, and lechery were cause of her confusion. Other things might be written of this Dame Eleanor, the which at irreverence of nature and of womanhood shall not be rehearsed. Silence is telling. Her husband is presented as a victim, and his absence is notable in the reports of the Duchess's examination and confession. Many historical texts, even now, shade into fiction making, using traditional techniques of storytelling to heighten the suspense of recounted events. So it's not particularly noteworthy that fiction and history blur between Lydgate's poem and contemporary chronicles. It is significant, however, that attaching this story to a specific literary period cuts off most of its historical arc. The literary history of Eleanor Cobham indicates her cultural significance, given that her representation is a major preoccupation of writers for over 150 years after her trial. Medievalists and early modernists have separately acknowledged the fascinating turns she takes across multiple genres, from religious prose to popular verse to historical drama. Yet because specialists from each field focus their analyses on their own respective periods, perhaps out of respect for each other's periods, interpretations of her story are often partial and sometimes even disjointed. Eleanor pops up time and again, but it's hard to determine why her story gained cultural traction across a host of literary and historical contexts. Here, today, I mean to put together that story because it affirms the need to get beyond period boundaries when we think about specific trajectories of pre-modern literary history. In this effort, I follow James Simpson, who remarks near the end of his magisterial reform and cultural revolution, quote, "Despite the many connections between medieval and early modern culture, there are, I am now convinced, very significant changes of cultural practice in the first half of the 16th century. Understanding those changes, I suggest, requires reading these literatures together, tracing critical paths that focus on the pre-modern more as a shifting gathering of interpretive problems rather than as an inert unfolding of historical period. To view the pre-modern as problem rather than as period, I maintain, is to be more straightforward about how our approach to particular literary examples, in my case, Eleanor Cobham, might shape research questions and critical conclusions. More broadly, attributing Eleanor's power to witchcraft, rather than approach Eleanor's literary history as it relates to the fraught consolidation of Lancastrian authority across Lydgate's verse or across medieval verse more generally, today I begin from a feminist standpoint, which reveals fundamental problems inherent to a model of selfhood that most of us here take for granted. As I will detail, across a number of sources, Eleanor is intentional, agential, autonomous, and capable. She evinces self-awareness, and she targets those who would bring about her and her husband's harm. As multiple iterations of Eleanor's downfalls attest, it's not treason and witchcraft that bring about her destruction per se. Instead, her fall transpires again and again because she dares to understand herself as invested with the kind of bounded selfhood that Charles Taylor links to contemporary accounts of modern subjectivity. And this is Taylor, quote, "This self can see itself as invulnerable, as master of the meanings of things for it," unquote. That Eleanor thinks of herself as untouchable in the domain of politics in which she lives is not just foolish, according to the sources that follow her trial. Rather, it is a sign of her misplaced conceit, of her misguided belief in her own motive powers. But why is she wrong, or even unnatural, to see herself as capable of charting her own course in this history? With its figure of the beguiling witch, to stay with Lydgate for just a moment longer, the complaint expresses suspicion of women's powers of self-determination within what's supposed to remain a man's world. More than a decade before Cobham's arrest, the false Circe, who leads her witches alla, gives the prince false medicines to make him strange and bow forsworn unto that godly fair princess. The prince is protected from charges of infidelity, but by blaming witchcraft, the poem portrays the prince as politically inert and morally blind. Indeed, agency in Lydgate's poem is dangerously zero-sum, making the prince's betrayal, he from his promise, his hand to draw, the product of Siren's new craft, we're told. He does not abandon the princess. Instead, the prince has been robbed of his individual will and personal integrity. More broadly, attributing Eleanor's power to witchcraft leaves no room for other women to exercise legitimate influence. Compared to the images of long-suffering and innocence structuring the princess's absence, any agency that women wield is threatening to men and destructive to other women. As the poem nears its close, masses of people express their support for the princess, but their political demands are characterized by physical yearning and spiritual patience. We're told rich and poor of all disreme, with whole heart and all lowness, him recommending to that princessa, praying with all humility that they may it sone say. The multitude can do nothing but hope and wait. Given that no man can act to restore the princess, the poem depicts a world of politics as overrun with women's wiles by corrupting influences no legitimate political actors can resist. Yet the poem seeks to follow the crowd's demand, out on the witches, evrich un. It rejects a version of political maneuvering and returns the land to a state of innocence. And clara troth shall shew his face, witches bodies away to enchase. The Bodleian manuscript, Ashmole 59, urges, so the copy of this that is in Bodleian Ashmole 59, urges, brenne alle those false witches, and leve not one. Lydgate could not know how ahead of the times a complaint would be. Chronicles go further than Lydgate's poem, making Eleanor Cobham into a warning for misplaced ambition. Scholars have noted that Cobham was merely the daughter of a knight. In the comparably elite circles in which she moved, her status might have made her a target. This was true, but all the punished conspirators in this plot were somewhat exceptional. Bolingbroke was a well-known Oxford scholar, a great and a cunning man in astronomy. And Jourdemain was married to a prosperous yeoman. No one was a complete nobody, but nobody was elite enough to be secure. This episode really is a withering commentary on the absolute insecurity of the age. Bolingbroke regrets that he says, he presumed too fair in his cunning. But the women, notably, are silenced by 15th century historical writings. Eleanor's diminishment is particularly egregious, given that Cobham historically was popular and was addressed using the terms of care and succor associated with powerful women's intercessory function during this period. So in historical sources outside the Chronicle, we see evidence that she actually was popular in England. She was addressed and included with her husband in letters patent requesting pardon, and in 1437, Catherine Hepburn, a wife of a York Glover, writes only to Eleanor to request aid for her husband, John. After her downfall, Cobham apparently retained the backing in the popular imagination if a 1443 confrontation between a woman named Juliana Ridligo and Henry VI at Blackheath in Kent is any indication. According to the Brute, she, this is Juliana, spoke to him boldly and reviled him ungoodly and unwisely for Dame Eleanor Cobham, that he should have her home again to her husband. So she implores the king to send Eleanor Cobham home. The king did not take kindly to the woman's plea on Eleanor's behalf, but as the narrative continues, he had the woman pressed to death for presumption. The king's brutal reaction to the woman's intervention points to Cobham's continued strength and potential support. One of the reasons she might have been moved, and again, just to say, she was moved to 4 different castles, right, so, across her imprisonment and her exile, and to some such remote locales, including the Isle of Man and the Isle of Anglesey, is that Henry VI feared her enduring esteem amongst the people. Indeed, some historians speculate that her comparably regular social status might have endeared her, even as it endangered her. Nonetheless, medieval ballads transform Eleanor into a real-life exemplum against women's pride. In The Lament of the Duchess of Gloucester, the eponymous protagonist voices a position of strength, albeit from a perspective of loss. She says, "With wealth, wale, and worthiness, he was beset on every side. Of Gloucester, he was duchess. Of alle men, he was magnified." Early stanzas recount Cobham's elevation, but even these convert potency into destruction, demonstrating fortune's relentless motion. She says, "He was so high upon the wale, my own estate he could not knowe." When she recalls her glory, the Duchess also admits her fault. "Me sovereign lord thus to forsake, it was a doleful destiny." Before she recounts her trial, the poem exults in the certainty of her defeat. "I rocht again all course of kind, and lost me creed for cruelty." The rise and fall of fortune, as imagined Eleanor tells it, is all a prelude to inevitable self-destruction. Her pride turns to grief as she recognizes the king's pity. "That worthy prince of his prudence, of my persona had pity." In voicing her regrets, Eleanor convicts herself as she confesses the wrongs she did. She says, "Alas, that ever I rocht treason, I had dealt with sorcery." Even more pointedly, the poem on the mutability of worldly changes, also from the second half of the 15th century, casts a judgmental eye over Cobham's deeds. "But suddenly she fell, as was her fate, and was arrested, all dismayed and mate. Its objective address leaves no doubt of Cobham's guilt, so this is not in the voice of Eleanor. But from the start, it constructs her as proud and high of heart. This poem's rendition of the Duchess's trial takes salacious glee in affirming her personal culpability of treason wrought against the king Algata, and thereupon committed unto prison. Unlike other Contemptus Mundi poems or other poems in a Decasibus tradition, whose instructive horror arises from Fortune's ability to reduce all those she glorifies, these poems blame Cobham for her rise as well as her fall. She reached too high for sorceria and egg for suspicion, and she deserved her destruction. And there of sorceria, founden, guilty and point special, and after she was sent unto a castle to abide perpetualia, and so she did till death away her hint. In popular ballads, Eleanor's demise was a plot that history could see coming. Indeed, the mutability links Cobham to other falls, including that of her husband, who was, we are told, to grunde him cast cruelly. Like later retellings, this poem associates the Duke's disgrace with his wife's destruction. Unlike later versions, however, she is fully to blame for her and her husband's misfortune, for her elevation precipitates his fall. She says, so low brocht him idun. It's not that she is targeted because she is easier to damage than her royal husband. On the contrary, the poem at least claims, she is at fault because this Ladia was so proud and hia of heart. So the poem says this multiple times. And he bears the brunt of her wayward actions, that after Suna he died, such was his grace. In praising the Duke of Gloucester for his manhood, puissance, and chivalry, this poem convicts Cobham of her own crimes, but also of her husband's downfall. And yet the more terrifying aspect of these poems is their insistence that Cobham's story is relevant to all women. The relentless refrain of the lament suggests Cobham is typical, not exceptional, despite the unusual details of her demise. And this is the refrain of the poem. She says again and again, all women may beware by May. As Jamie Fumo observes, the Balliol version of this poem doesn't include any mention of her treason or witchcraft. Instead, Fumo argues, this copy, quote, is clearly concerned to universalize Eleanor's experience so that it may serve the widest moral lesson. In the Cambridge version of the poem, however, 4 stanzas detail her guilt and her grief, so it kind of wallows in the details of her downfall. In all versions of the lament, the Duchess records a catalog of loss that is presented as an inevitable outcome of social overreach. Farewell, all wealth and world so weeda, eam signed where e shall be. Cobham's principal crime, as her many warnings emphasize, is against womanhood itself. To be ambitious is to transgress the boundaries set for women within any social domain, from elite to ordinary. Tudor treatments of Cobham are different than poems composed within a half century of her conviction. John Bale infamously characterized her as a Lollard, and John Fox made her religious persecution part of his Acts and Monuments, providing 10 reasons why her conviction was unjust in his reply to Alan Cope, also known as Nicholas Harpsfield. By making her into a target of religious persecution, Bale and Fox deflect attention away from Cobham's role in treasonous designs against the king. Even accounts that are plain about her wrongdoing, however, indicate the unfairness of her conviction. Robert Fabian is straightforward about her guilt, ascribing treasonous intent to her practice of image magic. He says, Dame Eleanor Cobham was arrested of certain points of treason and thereupon by examination convicted. She ordered the group to devise an image of wax like unto the king. Edward Hall similarly associates her necromancy with nefarious designs against the king. For first this year, Dame Eleanor Cobham was accused of treason for that she, by sorcery and enchantment, intended to destroy the king. She meant to bring harm, these chronicles insist, but she emerges even here as a victim of her impolitic age. Unlike late 15th century tellings of her downfall, which imagine Cobham as an accomplished plotter, those of the following century suggest Cobham was in over her head, at least politically. Hall said she acted to the intent to advance and promote her husband to the crown. And Fabian prefaces her crimes with a characterization of the violent age. This 19th year began murder and grudge to break at large. The machinations of ruthless men, even for Bale and Fox, embroiled Cobham in a conspiracy that she neither understood nor controlled. And while historians have also concluded that much in the Cobham affair was driven by a desire to damage her husband, 16th century versions of her demise are careful to separate Duke Humphrey from his wife's crimes. Unlike the mutability, which suggests the Duke of Gloucester's main fault was taking Eleanor Cobham for a wife, Tudor chronicles leave the Duke of Gloucester morally unscathed, but politically, personally destroyed. This paradoxical treatment is extended in the Mirror for Magistrates, which includes lengthy entries for Dame Eleanor Cobham and Humphrey Plantagenet, commonly called the Good Duke, in the 1578 edition. As George Ferrers imagines it, Eleanor recounts her misfortunes, first by affirming how her husband, and she says by virtue he was called the Good, raised her from her lowly station. Her insistence on her noble lineage, she says, is part of her defining pride. So she is frustrated that no one finds her sort of high enough to be married to the Duke of Gloucester. And she says, though by birth of noble race I was, of baron's blood, yet was I thought unfit. And this is also sort of marked as a sign of her defining pride. Even so, her legitimacy, Eleanor subsequently claims, derives from the Duke's benevolent affections. And this great prince, she says, without respect of state, did worthy me to be his wedded mate. In 3 different ways, which in a recursive structure amount to the first 50 lines of her account, she emphasizes that her elevation is due to the Duke's magnanimity, his affection, his grace. The stability of her position, guaranteed as it is by his strength, makes room for her overconfidence. She says, I sat so sure, methought I could not reel. The logic of the preliminary sections of Eleanor's entry suggests the Duke's attentions enabled her pride. The remainder of her account, however, insists that her fall is exclusively her fault. The tragedy that befalls Eleanor, she goes on to explain, results from the collision of her ambitions with those of other powerful courtiers, particularly the scheming Cardinal Beaufort. Her intention, she insists, was innocent. She says, God is my judge. I never had the will by any enchantment, sorcery, or charm, or otherwise, to work my prince's harm. She admits to consulting with the Witch of Eye, and to using the services, she says, of 2 priests also, the one hight Bolingbroke, the other Southwell, great clerks in conjuration. Her aim, though, was not, she claims, sort of diabolical. Instead, she says, she merely sought to cast and calk the king's constellation, and then to judge who should next succeed to England's crown. Now, I note that this is also illegal, and so we might say likely story, especially given, as Lily Campbell points out, Eleanor's version of the circumstances that led to her examination, conviction, penance, and exile is markedly different from Duke Humphrey's. Again, I am instructed by Campbell's claim that these entries are not complementary. They don't do the same work. Rather, they mobilize different versions of this history. And here you can sort of see a longer passage from Humphrey in which he says that she sort of conjures, and they had a wax figure, and they daily pitch it against the fire as the wax did melt. So he details the kind of crimes that they committed in a way that Eleanor does not. In the Duke's account, Eleanor's guilt is assured, and she is not simply playing around with forecasting. Instead, Humphrey suggests she was personally involved in image magic. But he also then goes on to say, after this sort of section of his account, that due to the gravity and jurisdiction of her crimes, he claims, and since the cause concerned deadly sin, which to the clergy only doth pertain, to deal therein I plainly did refrain. So he steps back from intervening in her case. He says he had to be content for her to be examined, and he accepts her conviction from a sorrowful distance. He says, I suffered them, her person, to a sight, which to my heart was sure the greatest spite. I mean, he takes this on as his own personal pain instead of hers, right? And throughout both tragedies, Eleanor is hyper-agential compared to Humphrey. She has a plan. She summons the co-conspirators. She falls on account of pride. Ferrers does not invest Eleanor with the guile of earlier versions. Indeed, Humphrey even suggests her interest in necromancy arises from, as he puts it, the nature of women always to be curious, to inquire of things to come. So it's just women's natural curiosity that makes her play around with witchcraft, not any kind of great plan for her own or her husband's advancement. And she's keen, too, to defend the innocence of her motives. Doing so, as we can all perhaps, I hope, see, diminishes the control that she wields, so that she's not in full command of those who are supposed to do her bidding. When she describes the Witch of Ai, for instance, her own powers look paltry by comparison to those of the powerful enchantress. She says about the Witch of Ai, this is what she says. She says, both fiends and fairies her charming would obey, and dead corpses from graves she could uprear. Such an enchantress at that time had no peer. So the Witch of Ai is the greatest enchantress in the entire realm. The dark forces Eleanor gathers far outstrip what she characterizes as a desire to help her husband by divining his future. I also note, though, that what we take to be a modern marker of selfhood, a directed capacity for individual agency, indexes a woman's faults here and elsewhere. The more agency a woman has, and so Eleanor in comparison to the Witch of Ai, the more evil she is. When she reflects upon the damage done to her and her husband, Eleanor wishes she were a witch, so that she could rain down punishments on the cardinal, right? And you can sort of see her extended kind of railing against the cardinal in this longer passage. She says, as would to God I had been for his sake, I would have clawed him where he did not itch, is one of the things that she says. And not coincidentally, she has this same power to rail and to curse in Michael Drayton's historical epistles. So Eleanor's kind of eloquence takes the place of action here and in later accounts. She continues in this same vein in The Mirror for Magistrates for 2 more stanzas, conjuring the kinds of agency she would like to muster, or she would have liked to have mustered, right, in the same kind of way that she would have, wishes she could have done against her enemy. Yet despite her extended anger, Eleanor merely details the kind of agency she doesn't have in this context. And if one of the interlocutors features in the prose link between Eleanor's and Humphrey's entries, he sort of wonders aloud, he sort of says, I wonder if she passeth the bounds of a lady's modesty to inveigh so cruelly against the Cardinal Beaufort. Another one, a voice in this link, defends her by suggesting that men must bear, he sort of says, with women's passions. So even when Eleanor is at the pitch of her anger and is ready to sort of do vengeance to those who have harmed her, this is imagined here as emotional upheaval, not deliberate or considered endeavor, right? So this is, for me, a really important point here. By contrast, the Duke's dearth of agency is also not weakness or a foolish disregard for his own safety and longevity. Instead, and in the same way as he treats Eleanor's crimes, he detaches himself from circumstances that might require his action. He offers an account of his downfall as a warning, but throughout his tragedy, he continues to evince a kind of entitled annoyance that his inaction seals his doom. As he explains, his susceptibility to a fall is structural, so that he says that such a climb to the top of high degree from peril of falling never can be free. He becomes vulnerable despite the fact that his social status is supposed to be unassailable. He says, who, trusting in all height of high estate, by foes least feared, was trapped into a snare. And so, despite the hard lessons he has learned, the Duke insists he could not lower himself to act on Eleanor's behalf. He says, my part was then to yield unto the time, giving her leave to deal alone therein. In very different ways, the Duchess and Duke of Gloucester are unequipped to prevent the schemes that lead to their tragic ends. The Duchess is exiled because she must learn, she says, my careful heart to cure, with patience most painful to endure. The Duke is murdered because enemies pursue their vain desire of sovereignty and rule. And look at the difference in register between these two things that they have to learn. She has to learn patience, and his murder is caused because of these sort of grandiose terms of sovereignty and rule. Her ambition signals illegitimate pride, while his dispassion conveys authentic nobility. She should not act, and he should not have to act. By insisting that women's agency is corrupt, the Mirror for Magistrates sidesteps the question of whether she could act were she allowed to do so. Importantly, Ferrers makes no room for the possibility that she might be nimbler than any of the men who feature in her complaint. Rather than observing that this is unfair, that the Duchess is judged using a sexist measure. I mean, she is. I'm just put that out there too. But I want to argue instead that her treatment does something greater. It exposes a prevailing organization of selfhood to critique. What might be expressions of her individualism, her intentionality, and her agency reduce her to a collateral player in the intrigues of her age. And indeed, it would be hard to argue that equity would result if she were simply allowed to scheme and plot in the same fashion as her enemies. The compilation that is the Mirror at least putatively challenges the transactional individualist striving identified with Cardinal Beaufort and his powerful ilk. The tragedy in Eleanor's downfall, as Ferrer's portrait in the Mirror for Magistrates reveals, and as Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 2, explores, is the expectation that individual selfhood be defined against all others in a total contest of competing wills. Down to its details, Shakespeare's history dramatizes the contrasting tragedies that consume the Duchess and Duke of Gloucester. Early in Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 2, the Duchess airs her ambition. She says, "Methought I sat in seat of majesty, and on my head did set the diadem." She looks forward to Lady Macbeth and the Weird Sisters, initially urging Duke Humphrey to seize the crown with her invitation. She says, "Put forth thy hand, reach at the glorious gold. What, is it too short? I'll lengthen it with mine." Her dreams of advancement prompt her husband to chastise her. He's banished the canker of ambitious thoughts. He sounds very huffy here to me. When he leaves her, she makes her frustration plain. "Were I a man, a duke, and next of blood, I would remove these tedious stumbling blocks and smooth my way upon their headless necks." Later, though, having gathered the necromancers and the Witch of Eye, so all of these folks are in this play, the group conjures a spirit on stage in Act 1, Scene 4, and this is a fascinating set of stage directions. And although they never met in real life, Eleanor is a special enemy to the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, who tells her intimate Somerset, "Not all these lords do vex me half so much as that proud dame, the Lord Protector's wife." In a play filled with scheming and butchery, there is room for only one overweening, ambitious woman. This is perhaps no surprise, given that every man in this court except the hapless Duke Humphrey and the hopeless King Henry VI engage in a relentless contest of total destruction. Gloucester is continually horrified by his wife, who understands more clearly the dangers and stakes of contest in this domain. When she's arrested, he's unable to compass her activities. He says, "And as for my wife, I know not how it stands. Sorry I am to hear what I have heard." And when she cries out for him, so there's this sort of scene where she is doing her penance and she cries out to him, his shock amounts to a form of indifference. "Be patient, gentle Nell. Forget this grief." He's unable to intervene, but it remains unclear if he would help his wife, even if he could. "Thy greatest help is quiet, gentle Nell. I pray thee, sort thy heart to patience." Over the course of the play, which chronicles the Duke's murder and Cade's rebellion, the Duchess falls quickly and decisively. Her wrongdoing is clear, and it is exposed and dispatched by the end of Act 2. Her precipitous ruin, however, does not reveal a world where treasonous plotters are duly punished. Shakespeare's Duke retains virtue even though he clings to an outdated and overmatched system of ethical fidelity. When he addresses his accusers, finally, he remarks on the follies of the age. Ah, gracious Lord, these days are dangerous. Virtue is choked with foul ambition. He remains bewildered by his peers' ruthlessness, even if he finally understands the danger posed to the king. And he finally says to the king, right as he's being taken away, "And wolves are gnarling who shall gnaw thee first. For, good King Henry, thy decay I fear." Eleanor, by contrast, understands this world, so much so that she might have thrived were she allowed to follow through on her ambitious designs. She says, "And, being a woman, I will not be slack to play my part in fortune's pageant." And yet her corruption is represented as so unnatural that she's the first to be destroyed. This is basic sexism, as I noted before, insofar as a capable woman is prevented from competing or prospering in the same fashion as the men around her. But let's look at the men around her. Eleanor's treatment uncovers the depravities of the individualist model of selfhood that sees all others as competitors and that seeks absolute domination as the defining personal achievement. To be sure, it is troubling that Shakespeare, like earlier writers, uses a woman to uncase the corruption inherent to this form of self-fashioning. But it is the model of selfhood that should cause consternation, because its conditions leave no room for Eleanor to survive, much less thrive. Were she to evince the yielding, pliable formation of selfhood, the patience that her husband sort of enjoins her to take up, that is extolled for pre-modern women, she would fare no better. In no small irony, the lowly lieutenant who slays the corrupt Suffolk inveighs against the depredations wrought by a war of all against all. Shakespeare does not imagine a woman whose resilience preserves her in this domain, which in itself is a devastating critique of the formation of selfhood that governs this tetralogy. We need not see Richard woo, then destroy Anne to understand the dangers for women or for anyone unevil in this realm. Elsewhere, I have written extensively about women who are overcome by their situations, who could not resist but could only endure the different forms of subjugation pressed upon them. Crusade, Constance, and Griselda are significant problem cases spanning the medieval, early modern divide. In Henry VI, Part 2, Shakespeare forecloses what I have argued is a counter-tradition of ethical virtue derived from women's embodied experience. In my present work, I continue to explore how writers across pre-modern England make room for what I call feminist subjectivity, which I have argued arises from imagining the human body not as closed, disciplined, or effectively distanced, but as open, fluid, and frequently compromised. But the literary history of Eleanor Cobham challenges this element of my work. She needs distance. She needs a kind of buffering in a way that she cannot attain. Now, and this is not just because she wants to be allowed to exercise her powers in a domain where she's not. Eleanor protests her treatment in a fashion affirming her superior command of the situation. She also reveals how bewilderingly frustrating it is to inhabit a subject position that is ultimately and that is designed to be doomed. She says, "Teach me to forget myself. Methinks I should not thus be led along, mailed up in shame." She is not alone, since, as the Mirror for Magistrates ominously portends, all men involved in Duke Humphrey's death would subsequently face destruction. And yet, Eleanor is held up as a cautionary fable to all women. In the Mirror, she urges, "Would God let good ladies, both now and evermore, of my hard hap, which shall the story read, would bear in mind and trust it as their creed. I ask what lesson all ladies are supposed to learn from this kind of storied history." Following the lead of earlier ballads, her transgressions against femininity subject her to humiliation and punishment. In Shakespeare, by contrast, women are arguably able to master the competitive, commanding, and cunning selfhood driving the men to deception and murder across these plays. The Henry VI plays are filled with formidable women, from Joan la Pucelle to Margaret of Anjou. The latter, it is worth noting, she appears in all 4 of the plays of this tetralogy. If Henry VI Part 2 was, as many scholars believe, one of the first plays Shakespeare ever wrote, then one of the first women of his historical imagination was Eleanor Cobham. With her character, Shakespeare reveals the intrinsic predations of the selfhood extolled as a marker of his age. By taking a longer view of Eleanor, moreover, Shakespeare and his predecessors reveal what happens if a model of subjectivity defined by domination eclipses all other modes of being. This extended look at Eleanor is frightening, I conclude, because it uncovers the destruction inherent to the formulation of selfhood, still identified as a marker of our own modernity. Thank you. We have time for questions. I've been told I'm allowed to call on people, and I would welcome your questions and your comments.
You said John Fox, who writes here as having experienced religious persecution. So thinking of our conversation earlier about these sort of alternative models that are cut off, I'm wondering if you see that, if there's any kind of alternative model of the subjects would be implicit in this for as experiencing religious persecution, or is that more in line with the version that we get for in Shakespeare?
No, I think that's a great avenue of thought. I mean, one of the things with Fox is that he offers 10 justifications for having included her. And he doesn't talk that much about her per se. It's just like why she should be included. But there is a chronicle account early in the century too that says she was forejudged for her heresy, and I want to pursue this as a kind of way of thinking about So witchcraft is charged as a kind of heretical, kind of out of bounds sort of position. And we see Marjorie of Jourdain burned as a consequence. And so I wonder if these early 16th century writers who are positing her as potentially as a religious martyr are consolidating or using heresy in that active kind of way. And so I would say yes, that is another kind of alternative. Fox, because he offers 10 reasons why she should be in there, but they are all, none of them have to do with her character. So but yes, I think you're exactly right in relation to that being another way of seeing her.
Thank you. I'm thinking more about the sort of fractures in the kinds of agency, especially around sort of material and political power and the work that witchcraft does there. And I'm wondering how much, I mean, it seems like there are kind of two elements of supernatural power. There's the seduction and the kind of love magic, which is also kind of image magic.
Yeah.
Some of that image magic, sometimes it sounds like reappears in relation to the king, but it seems like a lot of the later stuff is actually about conjecture and prediction and astrology too.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering in particular about that split between the kind of power that knowing is, the casting and cocking in that line, and the kind of power that the actual casting in other sense, or cocking in other sense, right? The making of wax. And I guess I'm wondering this too because of some of the class politics around Marjorie and sort of like the agency of having a personal wish as prosthesis kind of.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
And I'm thinking that image like extending her arm when she's talking about it there. Anyway, I guess how does sort of agency fall out in terms of those different kinds of powers, and does that change over the period? Because I feel like conjecture has a different social status by the 16th century too.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm struck by with her example is that there's every way of distancing or cabining agency in relation to the Duke. But that doesn't work with witchcraft. And you could sort of say, because she used witchcraft, this is not her doing anything. She's just, she's casting and conjecturing that this is a way of distancing her own personal kind of plan or agency. It actually magnifies it, at least in the fortune poems in the late 15th century, and even in mirror for magistrates as well, right? So it's actually a way of intensifying her wrongs and what she did, as opposed to what Humphrey is able to, his agency is boxed, he's protected for any of the kind of implications of his inaction across all of these texts. And so what I think I would say in relation to enchantment, or in relation to witchcraft and having one's own kind of personal witch, I mean, early texts as well, they don't call Eleanor a witch. They say that she meddled in sorcery and in witchcraft, and so there's a real division between what she did and what the party did and what the Witch of Eye did. And later she is accused of treason and witchcraft, right, in later texts. So it actually comes down on her in a way that is more direct. And so I think one of the things about that kind of fracturing of agency is that two different ways what you see is, I would like to say that in the first instance, there is an acknowledgement that a lot of elite women, and maybe even Marjorie Jourdain herself, served other elite women in this kind of role, and that this was a punishment of, and that Eleanor, really, she pushes her in front of that council as well, and sort of says, it was her, not me. And so you see that kind of, that vulnerability and the way it's being sort of cast off. But at the same time, she's trying to sort of say, I was only seeking to know certain things. Her agency was in relation to a kind of conjecture of knowledge, not of action. Whereas later, it's also action. So if you sort of say, it had a change by the 16th century, it seems to be equated to doing the same kinds of things that in the 15th century anyway, she's not doing in the Chronicles, right? So that's fascinating. I think in the 16th century, what you see is that she's capable, or one of my claims is that she's capable of action, but she's still not allowed, or she's punished only for that capability. She's one of those, the Americanist Molly Barnes calls them tricky white women. These women who sort of use their privilege in certain kinds of ways to finagle precarious social situations, often by victimizing other women of lower social status, or women who have other kinds of marginal kinds of standing. And you sort of see that happening, I think, definitely with Eleanor Cobham. And yet, what you also see is that you can never be unprecarious in this situation, right? So, and that to me is a really terrifying kind of aspect of this entire episode, right? So that what she shows is that for all of that maneuvering, for all that use of magic, for all that use of conjecturing, you can't get outside of punishment, right, for her. So, James.
Thank you, Holly, for a wonderful lecture. You talked really persuasively about gender and agency. Of course, you also talked about witchcraft, but I wonder if you could talk more about witchcraft and periodization, because as I understand it, trials for witchcraft in the late Middle Ages are extremely rare and restricted to very high profile.
Yeah, to Eleanor Cobham.
Whereas from 1542, the first statute against witchcraft, trials for witchcraft and persecutions of old women for being witches are extremely common. There are 2,000 of them up to the later 17th century. And they're lower class women. Could you just expatiate more on the periodic representation of witchcraft and how that plays out
In England.
across the texts in England?
No, the crucial point that you're making here, that there is a difference between 15th and 16th century. Across the 15th century, 4 royal women are accused of witchcraft. But Eleanor Cobham is the only one who's tried for witchcraft, in this way and punished for witchcraft. Joan of Navarre was imprisoned for witchcraft for 2 years, and then she was released. You have Elizabeth Woodville and Jacquette of Luxembourg also accused of witchcraft and sort of maneuvered and used in that way in the 15th century. But exactly, as soon as you start to move witchcraft out of the ecclesiastical courts, into more secular kind of examination sort of scenarios, it becomes old women, a kind of punishment for what had been a village role of healer, of seer, of a kind of procuring of love magic in different kinds of ways that different communities clearly relied upon. And I think one of the reasons that the scandal of Eleanor Cobham was so scandalous is that it involved both a royal woman and a village witch, right? So that you have both of those elements of this, and you sort of see what's coming in relation to how witchcraft is going to be reframed in the 16th century as this kind of nefarious, diabolical kind of practice by low-status women that are easily disposable. But you're exactly right, that until the 16th century, you don't have that many cases, and they are targeted at highly, the most elite women of the realm are ironically the ones who are subject to it, and then it flips. And then you have the kind of witches as low-status women who are practicing a kind of natural magic that had been perhaps not even tolerated, but also vital to community kind of sustenance in the earlier centuries.
So it's prophetic in its way.
Lydgate is so weak. I mean, I don't know what's going on with that poem. I mean, that he would be sort of inveighing against witches in that way, that Cobham would be so subject, and that Marjorie Jourdain would be as well, is prophetic. I mean, it shows you what's coming, and it's not good. Yeah, Lisa.
So you talked a little bit about sort of the notion of emotional upheaval, it being sort of what she's inveighing or sort of saying about herself in one of the later texts as emotional upheaval rather than a mental machination.
Yeah.
So the idea that men just have to bear with these passions, and of course I'm the one who kind of wants to know, and you can do what you want with this question, is like, how do we make sense then of masculine action as being read, even now, because with students, they'll see someone in a play or whatever, and they're like, he is being reasoned and logical, but she is emotional.
Yeah.
And I have to push to get my students to see, like, even though you're seeing action from men does not mean it's not.
Or you're not. So with Humphrey, all he's doing is emoting. Right, across the mirror for magistrates and Henry VI. He's just like, I have to deal with this kind of problem, and that I would have to act. He's so annoyed and put out, and also this is, just a kind of encumbrance upon him, and that's all he's doing, right? And it's not read that way. It's supposed to show his innate nobility. He's something of a folk hero in the 16th century, the good duke, that's all he's called across the century, even in poems in which his own culpability for all of these events are kind of laid bare too. He still maintains, or at least people, that kind of label is still attached to him. And so it's not even, his is not rational kind of logic. It's actually this chivalric nobility such that he shouldn't have to be burdened with thinking through a plan or any kind of these kind of machinations. He should be above all of that. I mean, that's when he's also just kind of shocked that people would deign to, sort of topple him, right? So that's fascinating to me, is that, it's not that. So by the time you get to Richard III, there is that calculating, that kind of, the scheming. And you see it in Henry VI Part 2, too, with Suffolk, with Cardinal Beaufort, all these other kind of very bad characters. But, by the time you get to Richard III, there is a kind of, at least it's got a luster or an appeal that is terrible, and yet it is associated with a kind of logical rationality and a kind of maneuverability in ruthlessness that I think these earlier Henry VI plays are like, you don't want that, right? So.
So I have a question about gender and gender essentialism that I keep trying to formulate. And I guess the place to start with that is that on stage, Eleanor Cobham would have been played by a boy.
Yeah.
And there's something really gender fucked about Eleanor Cobham, where she is evincing desires or performing things that seem like sort of men's prominence, you're saying. But in some ways, because it's witchcraft and also possibly natality, right? Trying to get pregnant with the Duke's baby is also highly feminine. So it's like super biological feminine stuff, love potions, baby having. Yeah. While at the same time, it's like weird male stuff. Power wanting, domination, grabbing. So this combination of gender things almost seems to me like her problem is not that she's a woman, her problem is that she's not a woman.
Yeah. Okay. But you mean that she doesn't have, yeah, that's exactly right. She doesn't have the sort of supposed protections or the ability to sort of, she can't be pliant and passive and allow someone to claim to need protection. Nobody's going to do that in that kind of what you see in the world of Henry VI. So for her to have that kind of natal power to say this is dynasty making in this other way that needs a kind of fostering, absolutely not, right? And no women have that across all four of those plays, right? And so yeah, that you don't have that. So the kind of patriarchal ruthlessness that I'm tracing here with the men and with her, usually that relies pretty explicitly on women to take on a kind of helpmeet role and provide those kind of natal functions, etc. But when everybody takes it up, you just sort of see, it's not that when men are just subjugating women, it's that, oh my God, when this stuff is just let loose on everybody, it's really clearly a pretty terrible kind of dynamic, right? So there's no kind of cover. There's no women to give it cover. Yes. There's no women to soften it and make it seem like it's reasonable, right, in these Henry VI plays. Right? And so the women, Margaret of Anjou, the way that Eleanor Cobham, the way that they voice their own kind of alignment with those sort of masculine programs, I think exposes those masculine programs to greater scrutiny than if they were to say, oh yes, let me help you with this dynastic function, the way that Anne does in Richard III. Mm-hmm. And then, she dies, which should be an indication.
You die both ways.
Yeah, right? Yeah, you die both ways, right? And so I think this tetralogy, for me, that radical energy is that scary, that there is no place of occupying this that would be safe, where you say, oh, wait, I'm going to be the pliant, passive, help-meet woman. Absolutely not. Yeah. So again, me, when I was reading all this stuff, I was just like, she was going to die, right? There's no quarter here. There's no place for her to stake out. There's nothing. And, me sort of looking at her going, she's actually become better at this kind of maneuvering by the time that Shakespeare imagines her, is just another kind of reflection, I think, on the fact that there was never any space for her in this, across all of these different texts. So, yeah.
Would you say that Shakespeare's imagination of her kind of takes into account the institutional frameworks that subjugated women and kind of made ambition a bad thing? Or would you say that he kind of wrote it in a way that was intentional and built up?
I think he takes advantage of both. Why not both? Right? There's this kind of moment that he's like, okay, we'll vilify her or vilify ambition in this kind of character, and she's wicked and she's interesting and she's, has this kind of, again, this stage presence. When you put this kind of energy on the stage, it has this kind of fatal kind of, appeal to it. So he does that, I think, at the same time. He is also not super elite, by the way. And so seeing that if you don't occupy a position of ultimate, kind of security, everybody's going down, also speaks to whoever that boy is who's playing Eleanor Cobham, but whoever that playwright is who's putting all these unprecarious or precarious people on stage too. So I think, again, I think he's looking at this kind of, what I would suggest that what this shows is that Shakespeare is, that dramatization has it both ways. And let's condemn her, but let's also condemn this larger model for the way that it allows this kind of personal ambition to just run rampant. And, an emphasis on domination, right, is something that I don't think I sort of said enough. Yeah?
This kind of brief, so I'm sorry to ask another one, but the last two questions have me going back to that line, being mailed up in shame.
Yeah.
And it seems, it's chainmail, right?
Yeah.
Clothes. So it seems like a weird kind of travesty, to use a loaded word, on a kind of Venus in arms image, right? But that she is mailed up in shame, I think, to go back to what Masha is saying about the kind of gender weirdness too, right? That she's put on arms, but then still in clothes, but somehow still hard, but somehow still soft.
Yep.
And it seems to be almost like that she's being led. I feel like Shakespeare's going to rewrite that in Cleopatra's Anxieties, being led through the streets and being buoyed to go back.
The buoy, yeah. But the shame doesn't do any work for her here. Later, I think it does, right? So that, you impact, like it's meant to have an impact on an audience, like that her shame is meant to reverberate outward and to affect an audience. And it doesn't here. I mean, Humphrey's just like, well, be patient now. I mean, it's wildly inadequate to the occasion and the kind of what he's saying to her. So, like what shame might offer is a kind of protection that you're able to shame an audience into sort of exposing your own shame. The way that you're having to watch someone in the spectacle doesn't work in this play. But I mean, I think that I have to look at the Cleopatra again. I do think that those kinds of worries about shame, but also what they do are more effective elsewhere. And I would be the first one to sort of think of that as meaningful and as a kind of way of thinking about women having an independence, right? It's through their shame that there's something else might emerge, but I don't think it does here, which is, yeah. I saw a hand, yeah.
I'm also thinking with Masha's comment about actors. I'm curious, this is more comment. I'm thinking whether Jean-Luc Picel would have been written for the same one who played
That's a great, yeah.
Eleanor Cobham in the second part. And so that honesty becomes more specific for
Yeah.
for channeling in that perspective.
When, I mean, if with that, if I were in a company now, that would be an amazing kind of sort of through performance that would be very powerful. And I mean, I haven't, that there may be some theater history that suggests that if you're thinking about how roles, how best to assign roles and what a company would do, there may be some evidence of that. That's an amazing kind of observation. I want to go look, but I don't know.
We have time for one more question, and I'll remind you there's a reception after that you can ask questions more privately. Yes, it will not be all mailed up. So is there one more question, or shall we? Yes, please.
If there's room for one. So I'm pondering her original, the early arguments, the early trial stuff before the literary sort of remaking, which is really more of what you're showing and atomizing really effectively. But I'm pondering that eruption of witchcraft into legal form, which maybe comes out of some of the innovations in heresy trials that start in the 15th century, and where you yoke that to political purposes quite directly. You start burning heretics. The whole that may supply a kind of precedent for that. But the argument, I'm doing this to have your child to fulfill the sort of patriarchal trajectory here. Apparently it worked, I guess. Although it at least it reprieved her of punishment for treason, which
it did. Well, that's because she was a peeress of the realm, and they did know how to try her.
Okay.
So the following Parliament, I'm going to get it wrong, I think it's 1442, they change. There's a statute that's passed that says any peeress will be tried for treason in the same way as male peers in future. So her scandal also causes that. So wow, right? So they didn't know what to do with her in relation to the treason charge. There is evidence, or some of the chronicles, which I'm kind of new at reading chronicles in this kind of way, but like some of the kind of, the stagecraft of Bolingbroke, and the kind of way that some of the sort of first person and the way that this all kind of comes forth in this, historical accounts, it is meant to be a kind of titillating, sensational kind of, sort of read as well, right? So I don't want to sort of, make too hard a distinction between, Lydgate's definitely writing a kind of semi-allegorical poem, but at the same time, some of those chronicles, the way that they present her is also, it's clear in terms of her guilt, which maybe, maybe that was cutting against certain kinds of popular status that she might have had. And it's also clear that nobody had ever contemplated this kind of treachery before, right? So the chronicles make a lot of that uncovery of this plot.
So is the accusation that she's trying to kill the king early, is that appeared in the same, is that floating around at the time of the trial? So you have two options already from the get-go in thinking about her.
Yeah, and so she goes more mundane, right? So what she confesses to, and this is, so they wanted, so if you draw the king's horoscope and you imagine the death of the king, then that's meant to be a kind of, treasonous kind of, from 1352. That should qualify. Because she's a woman, They're not sure what to do with that, right? And so what she confesses to, maybe cannily, is she sort of says, oh no, I wasn't doing treason. I was doing love magic instead. And so this is much more homely and kind of, as you say, this kind of, thinking about like sort of patriarchal dynasties and helping with that, right? And so that probably got her out of some trouble, but so it is potentially a strategic confession as well, right? So that to confess to love magic, and the 5 charges she did confess to are all about having Humphrey love her, and it's all this kind of romance plot kind of thing that she really wanted his affections, right? Now, there is no evidence that they had children. There's 2 illegitimate children that might have been hers. Humphrey never legitimizes them. Never moves to do so, even after. So he marries her in 1428. And so this happens in 1441. And in that time, if she had had children, so she's his mistress from 1420, as early as 1424, over that period that they're together, yeah, it's just wild, right? So I'm just going to say that as a critical, So I'm not sure what to make of the fact that actually that dynasty or that kind of patriarchal kind of lineage making, she never does that either. So.
Please join me in thanking our speaker for this.